Hi guys, good morning, or whatever time it is for you guys. My name is Kenneth, and I'm a creative director for Ground Zero Radio and the director for this Earth Focus podcast series. Thank you for clicking on our third and final episode, and I hope you enjoy it. Put a lot of work into it, and this is my first digital content that I'm directing, so obviously issues have come up. Some we fixed, some you probably already seen or about to see. But we have some new content in the works, and one of them is coming out soon, probably next week. But then again, we're masterclass procrastinators, so who knows? But our very own Juan Mendoza will be interviewing poet, educator, activist, and director Aurelio Valdez on his interview slash podcast. Not really sure. So stay tuned for that. Watch the other episodes if you haven't already, or if podcasts aren't your thing. Check out our in-studio session with Jordani, which we filmed before quarantine and all that. And now to the actual podcast.
Hello, you are listening to the third and final episode of the Earth Focus podcast by SHS EnAct and GZ Radio. Earth Focus is a three-part discussion podcast series between students and guests with environmental backgrounds. Each episode, we covered an environmental topic. The past episodes discussed pollution, change, and ocean acidification. For today, we will be talking about environmental justice. I'm Sophie. I use she, her pronouns. I am a student at Sammamish High School. I'm involved in our school's environmental activism club, and I recently joined Washington Youth for Climate Justice.
And I'm Kimaya. I also use she, her pronouns, and I'm a sophomore at Sammamish High School, and I serve as the executive coordinator for Washington Youth for Climate Justice.
And hi, I'm Sophia Mckinstry. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a senior at Sammamish High School, and I'm also in the AP Environmental Science class.
The two guest speakers, would you please introduce yourselves?
My name is KayLani Siplin. I use she, her pronouns. I'm one of the lead educators at Islandwood for their urban school programs in Seattle.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie Stroble, and I work for King County for our climate action team, and I lead our climate equity and community partnerships work. And I originally am from Hawaii, but I've been in the Seattle area for about 15 years. And I'm really excited to be here today.
Hi everyone, my name is David Spataro. I use he, him. I teach political science and geography at Bellevue College, and I'm the co-coordinator of the school's Climate Justice in the Curriculum project.
Awesome. Sophia, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, so today we will be covering the effects of systemic environmental racism in America, the consequences of having rolled back environmental policy in the US, and how we can foster sustainable development while also giving more agency to communities that have previously been historically silenced.
Systemic environmental racism has disabled communities of color across America and the rest of the world. Climate or environmental justice is the initiative to combat the climate crisis in the broader context of systemic racism by fostering meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies.
The first question we have for you all is, how has systemic environmental racism stunted the development of communities of color?
I'm happy to just jump in and get us started. Does that work for everybody?
Wow,
So,
that's great.
There were a couple, as I looked over this beforehand, there were a couple of things that I thought would be worthwhile to discuss. So there are significant health disparities that we see as a result of the uneven geographic distribution of toxins. And those can be disparities in, for example, asthma rates, They can be disparities in other, just other health conditions. And the cascading effects of that can influence people's ability to perform at their jobs, their ability to work, their ability to do all kinds of things for their community. So that means we lose not only people's best self, but it impacts people's household in a variety of ways. And then the second point I'll add before letting others jump in is just a question of intergenerational wealth and the value of people's homes and what they're able to basically pass on to others, because obviously residential segregation plays a significant role here, and Black and other communities of color home ownership, not only are the rates differential, but the way in which home values increase in those communities is less than in white communities. And there are a variety of ways in which white preferences for segregated neighborhoods plays a role, but environmental toxins also play a role as well. And so issues of the ability to build wealth come into play as well. So let's stop with those two.
I'll build off of what David said, that if we go back to a time when we had very explicitly racist policies, which we still have racist policies, but these are ones that actually named it, right? You go back to how we planned our cities, how we decided who got to live places. In the Seattle area, the original first displacement that happened was of our Indigenous people from downtown Seattle. The Duwamish people were pushed and not allowed into that area. And the legacy of them both losing that land, and then now they're not a federally recognized tribe, so they don't even get benefits from the federal government for that. There's no reservation. The areas that are their traditional lands have been highly polluted. The Duwamish Longhouse is along the Duwamish River, which is right along that area is a Superfund site, which is a designation by the EPA for an area that is extremely contaminated. So there's now a mandate to clean it up. And then you build from that of policies that if you were a person of color, you were not allowed to live in certain neighborhoods. There was redlining that happened. And this happened with the Native community, the Black community, and Asian immigrants that were coming in at that time. And then you build from that, and then there were racial covenants, which actually were in the properties, the deeds of properties that said if you were, not white, you basically could not own, live, rent, buy any property in those neighborhoods. And a really great resource for this is the University of Washington has a site that you can actually look up all of the racial covenants for the King County area, and they were all over, not just in the city of Seattle, but all over King County, and you can actually find where all of those were and what the language and wording was. But when you think about where housing was allowed, even, right, the more desirable areas that were next to the water, that were up on the hill, those are the areas where people of color were not allowed to live, right? So you fast forward to now, and building off of David's comment about generational wealth, right? The areas that are closer to contamination sites, that are closer to the freeway, that are where the air quality isn't as good, or there's less trees, are the areas that are also cheaper to live in, right? And so when you add all those things in, you see a pattern where people of color have been basically are congregated in certain neighborhoods, right? And that's a legacy of racist policies that have continued on, right? When you look at maps around poverty, health outcomes, pollution, you end up seeing that communities of color, low-income communities, are all in like South Seattle, South King County. That's where the highest concentrations are, right? The Washington State Tracking Network, which is the Department of Health, has this really great map resource that you can actually look at. They created an environmental justice index. So you can actually look at by census tract, like all the different areas and the exposure risks. What are the things in there that you can actually look at the data and break it down from there.
Oh, I think the Wi-Fi cut out for Sophie. Let's see.
At least she's not frozen in an unfortunate face. She looks fine.
Yeah.
So the next question has to do with the president's decision to roll back EPA regulations. So do you guys think that that decision is perpetuating the existence of systemic environmental racism, and just elaborating on the effects of the...
I would agree that yes, some of those rollbacks absolutely would exacerbate some of those issues that were mentioned by David and Jamie, especially thinking about like the Clean Water Act and how many people currently in our country now don't have access to clean water. And by rolling back some of those protections, you are opening up essentially, like, you're getting rid of that accountability that people have to maintain clean water, to limit their pollution into bodies of water. And essentially it's, it's hurting the environment more, it's hurting human health, it's putting that at risk. And those health issues that have already existed in those lower income communities and communities of color is just going to go up. And those health risks are, it's just going to be worse for those communities. And put a lot of people at risk that may not even currently be at risk at the moment.
Another piece that I would add in is that on the federal level, we actually rely on the EPA to interpret these laws in new ways that can solve some of these problems, really because of the stable bias in our system. It's extremely hard in our system to get new legislation, especially progressive legislation, especially legislation that's going to take down white supremacy. It's very difficult to get that through. And with issues like carbon emissions, as well as many others, Congress hasn't passed any laws dealing with many of these issues. And it's come down to pressure being put, often by communities of color, often by activists working with sometimes the states, sometimes with other major national and international groups like Greenpeace, to put pressure on the EPA to interpret vague laws, which many laws are quite vague, but interpret them in ways that can then lead to rules and regulation. And so when, like, the Trump administration or any administration kind of scales back support or tries to deregulate within the EPA, it kind of creates a process along with that status quo bias that prevents the kind of change that's needed. And then additionally, I would argue that just in terms of the way change has occurred in our system, there's often been basically a demand by like communities of color for racial justice or forms of justice that local elites do not respond to and either do not want to or do not have the power to deal with. And it's only when the federal government, being by locals, to step in. We can look at the civil rights movement and the federal government occupying the South and to ensure that civil rights laws have been implemented. When the federal government backs away from this work, then it does make people more vulnerable. The federal government is certainly not a savior in any regard, and there's these periods where, with pressure, the federal government's been willing to step in, and when they step back, I do tend to think it's a very bad sign.
Yeah, I work in climate change, and so the issue of climate change is a global problem, right? And I also work for a local jurisdiction, which is there's only so many levers and controls that a local jurisdiction has, and there are a lot of places where we don't have control or influence, and the EPA is, or the federal government is really this place where you can have an across the board policy that could apply to a broad area. When you think about climate change and the impact that you want to make, if King County is implementing one policy, but the neighboring counties aren't and the rest of the state isn't, is that going to make a big enough difference for us to really make an impact on climate change, right? One of the examples I think about is the rollback of federal fuel economy standards, right? And this is basically, that means like the miles per gallon that your car gets, and basically setting a minimum MPG, miles per gallon, that a car needs to get, right? Part of this was, an effort to reduce the carbon emissions, because transportation is a huge sector of our greenhouse gas emissions overall. And we had been relying at the county for what had been established already, and part of our overall goals to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 80%, right? And if without that, now we're having to rethink all of our models, because that is now going to, with the rollbacks on some of those things, it's making it so that it's going to be harder to reach our climate goals.
All right, so our next question
Can I just jump in for a second?
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, Sophia. I wanted to tie that in locally as well in terms of racism and issues of residential segregation, which is that in kind of deindustrializing or deindustrialized cities like Seattle, where a lot of manufacturing has left, I mean, some remains, but a lot of polluting industries end up in other areas, both in the country and internationally. But one of the primary sources of toxins for Seattleites are exhausts, and primarily having to do with highways, which cut through communities. And so something like, MPG standards nationally, it hits all those things that Jamie mentioned. And then when we think about what would a highway system that isn't a point of a major toxin for people and all the homes that are closest to it. I mean, even beyond talking about a society like ours, but that's a significant area of Seattle-based toxicity is exhaust.
And to add to that really quick, I used to work in air quality, indoor and outdoor air quality, with one of our tribes, and one of the things that was clear is if the closer you are to living to the freeway, or the closer you are to living next to railroad tracks or freight or a really busy road, your risk of your cancer risks goes up, your asthma and respiratory illness rates go up. And imagine when I was younger and in my early 20s, I lived literally in an apartment building right next to I-5, and in the summers it was so hot I would leave my windows open and not think about it, and this layer of black dust would just form on my windowsill every day, and I'd have to wipe it away, just not thinking about the fact that I was breathing that in. But and I was there for 3 years, but imagine if that's the only place that you can afford to live. I lived there because it was cheaper, right? And imagine that you have a small child, and that child, kids are disproportionately impacted because their lungs are so small, right? And you're just breathing in all of that particulate matter, right? So anyway.
All right. So
sorry.
Sophie's here.
Continue.
Okay, good. You can go ahead.
So Jamie, building off of that, why do you believe, or can you explain why is it important to center Indigenous leadership when fighting the climate crisis?
With this one, these are our Indigenous community members have been on this land for thousands of years. They are deeply connected to the land. They have stewarded this land throughout that time and have that experience with working with the land and the environment throughout their history, especially here in Washington State. And so with that, we need to recognize that climate has changed a lot during that time. And these are people that have been on this land and have experienced that climate change through time firsthand and have passed on that knowledge through the generations. And so by being able to work with them in solving issues with the climate crisis or any other environmental issues, they have a lot of background and personal experience to how they have managed those changes and adapted to those changes in their own communities, and be able to provide some insight for how they were able to be resilient against those changes in ways that our mainstream Western culture and science may not know. And so it's really important to include those different communities to present, have access to a wide variety and diversity of ideas and problem-solving strategies.
Absolutely. Jamie, do you have anything to add? Or even David, anything to build off of what KayLani said?
I would just add to that, and I 100% agree with what KayLani was saying. I would just add to that those closest to the problem know the impacts and have the solutions. And so it's really important that we are involving the folks that are the most impacted by the issues of environmental justice and climate change. We talk about in our office about climate change as being a threat multiplier. So it's something that makes existing inequities worse. So environmental justice and environmental racism was already there. And then let's add climate change on top of that, right? It's gonna make that worse. And so it can't just be, our solutions can't just be a bunch of not very diverse people making all the solutions, right? It has to involve our Indigenous communities, our Black communities, our POC communities, our immigrant and refugee communities, and having those people at the table in order to make decisions.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said so far, and just want to jump on to some of those things and talk a little bit about Indigenous sovereignty. In terms of like the countries and the companies that are causing a lot of the problems, especially with regard to carbon emissions, both the countries and the corporations rely on forms of kind of what people call settler colonialism, where dispossession of people and domination over other groups is a core feature of it. And in terms of like just, there's so many layers to what's already been said in terms of those who are at the front lines leading the struggle, those who are there, and then I would say just on top of it, like companies want to get to mineral rights, fossil fuels that are under territories that are not territories of their either the state that company is affiliated with. And many places throughout the Americas, whether we talk about the Amazon rainforest or the boreal forests in so-called Canada, these are areas that essentially the white settler colonial project doesn't really have a legal basis to grant title. So Indigenous land title and Indigenous sovereignty is a core prevent that stuff from being taken out of the ground. And I think that can be a kind of instrumentalist kind of take for white environmentalists like myself. Like, if we support title, then we can save ourselves. I think there's something even beyond that about who we are. When I'm speaking personally as a white in the U.S., how there's a different relationship with both the land and with other sovereign nations.
Okay, well, thank you so much, all three of you, for answering our questions. I think right now we are going to be taking a quick little break, and then we will be back right after. David, if you want to get us started off, how has the homeless crisis been exacerbated by the climate crisis, and what can we do to support community?
I was hoping you wouldn't start with me. I didn't have prepared on this one.
Oh, okay,
That's
we'll start
okay.
with,
That's okay.
Okay.
Well, the thing that I immediately thought of that I think is important is just a relationship between social goods, like we might talk about social housing, like public housing, and the energy use and the justice that we need in order for basically everyone to thrive in this coming and current world that we're in. So like, there are a whole bunch of different consequences that happen to people when they experience homelessness. And then on top of it, we criminalize them, and that causes more harm. But I just think in general, thinking about this issue as it relates to climate justice makes me immediately think that we need a very strong policy around public housing, the ability to start to talk about energy use and how like we can have social housing without the amount of energy, because a significant amount of electricity we use is in our homes. So how can we have more of a strong social policy around ensuring everybody has homes, everybody has the access to the energy that they need. And everyone, frankly, when we start to talk about cities, everyone has the safety they need when the heat waves come, because we know heat waves are coming, and we know that heat waves are going to be more intense in poor areas. And so climate control is going to become a significant issue for justice if it isn't already. So just stop there, sorry everyone.
If I could jump off of what you were saying about heat waves and thinking about in urban spaces, my programs at Islandwood focus a lot on stormwater, which is the biggest contributor, if not one of the biggest contributors to pollution and Puget Sound in our urban water bodies. And when we think about people experiencing homelessness in the city and in urban spaces, like David was just saying, they're exposed to those elements, whether it's heat. If we think about stormwater, and with climate change, we should expect there to be increased flooding in our urban spaces. Those are people that are out there on the streets or in their cars that might be impacted significantly by having a space flood. And that makes me think about too, in not quite as urban spaces. I lived in Skagit County, and the river flows right through town. And there's a lot of people that take shelter in nearby parks right along the river. And when that river floods, they have to leave. And so when we think about increased storms and stormwater, with that also comes increased pollution. So when we think about people who don't have access to shelter, to clean water, to bathrooms, not only are they being personally impacted by the pollution that is on the streets because they're interacting with it since they are out there themselves, but unfortunately, that is also the place where their waste goes. And so if we have people who are not sheltered and don't have access to facilities, they are leaving waste in public, unfortunately. And when it rains, where does that go? It's going to go in our storm drains and our nearest bodies of water. And so we need to have some kind of change to address that problem as we think about these environmental issues that are impacting our homeless community members and others in our urban spaces that might be getting worse.
To build off of what David and KayLani said, I think it's also about preventing more homelessness. So where are the folks who are already on that kind of cusp of housing insecurity, and how can we have ways to support them not losing their housing in the first place, right? I think that a lot of our social policies are climate resilience policies, right? that we need to have those safety nets. We need to help people stay in their homes. We need to have, if you think about the reasons people lose housing, right? A lot of times it's connected to losing a job or a medical emergency that happened, and then they've got these crazy medical bills that they can't pay, right? So this is kind of getting at the fact that all of those different crises are connected, right? One of the things I'm working on a new kind of climate justice, climate equity chapter of our strategic climate action plan, which is hopefully coming out in the next month or two. And one of the things where we have a community-driven section that I'm leading with community members that are from different, we're calling frontline communities, so communities that are impacted first and worst by climate change and have experienced current and historic inequities. And one of the things that they're identifying is that housing is connected to climate change, food access is connected to climate change. And you know, if one of our partners is doing a study on a community-based study around energy and communities of color, and interviewed a whole bunch of community members and said, you know, how hard is it to pay your bills? What's going on? And as we see rising energy costs because of climate change, what is that going to mean for folks who don't qualify for utility assistance? The barriers to getting utility assistance are already really difficult. What does this mean for our undocumented folks that don't feel comfortable giving all this documentation in order to get utility assistance in the first place, right? And then they found, some of their interviewees, people were having to make choices between paying for food or paying their utility bill, or paying for their utility bill or paying for rent, or paying. And those sorts of decisions that have to be made impact your health, impact your well-being, impact your ability to pay for other essential needs. And you know, there were people who are unplugging their fridge for a weekend just to try and save a little bit of electricity, and putting all your food into a cooler, right? Like these are real decisions that people have to make, and we need to recognize that we need to invest more in our community safety nets, right? The other thing was around kind of urban heat island and extreme weather. This is kind of something that was brought up by other folks. And you know, we need to have coordinated strategies, not just about like, let's plant a tree in front of this one apartment building. It's how are we strategically putting investments into neighborhoods that are underinvested in. Looking at, if you look at maps of tree canopy coverage across King County, you'll see, oh, look, we know where those spots are. It's the places that have lots of concrete, the air quality is worse, there's less trees, there's less open space access, and then really working with those communities around what are the solutions to that, and how can we come up with a strategy that's going to be more resilient. I think in the end, it's just that, you know, we know housing and climate are connected. And, you know, we don't have what other areas of the country are, which is, you know, if we had a Hurricane Katrina or a Hurricane Harvey, you look at the outcomes of that in those states, and you'll see that disproportionately communities of color were impacted, and then also, you know, had a harder time recovering from that, right? So how are we building in ways that people can not just recover, but bounce forward, right? How are they going to come out of a crisis even stronger than they were before? So thinking really strategically about our policies, our investments, our budgets, paying attention to our leadership and making sure that they know these are important investments.
Yes, thank you. That's so important to understand. As our second to last question, because we're kind of running out of time, KayLani, can you maybe explain how can people recognize their privileges and then employ it to dismantle environmental racism? Can you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah,
real
I know.
Quick, can you repeat the question one more time?
How can people recognize how can we recognize our privileges and then employ them to dismantle environmental racism?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, there's a whole lot wrapped up in there, and I think one of the first steps is first acknowledging that privilege exists, despite the hardships you may have had in life, and taking a second to take a step back and think about the things that you are privileged to have, whether that is housing, access to clean water, education, a stable job, and then think about the community members, even in your own city, for example, who might not have those things and how that might impact them. And by being able to see that those differences exist and being able to use your voice to speak up about that. Because I feel like a lot of people that do have that privilege, whether it be education or finances, are typically the ones that have a bigger sway at the decision-making table, whether it's to change policies or to support school funding or those kinds of things. And so by being able to implement your voice, and if you have the funds and the resources to put that forward to fight for the things that other community members don't have, is a great first step in making that happen. But definitely being able to, as an individual, recognizing that privilege exists, you might have it, and breaking that down and what that means for you and what that means for what you can do is probably the first step in addressing that.
Does anyone else want to add to that question, or?
Oh, Jamie, do you want to go?
Oh, go ahead. I'll go after you.
Okay, I was gonna, since the divestment movement is such a prominent part of climate justice, I was just gonna add in that in terms of, people with privilege, like myself, white privilege, male privilege, there is an element of divesting from the things that that you are invested in. You're, as a white person, as I was saying before, I know that like homeownership means the accumulation of wealth, and that is connected to white desire to live in segregated neighborhoods. That is connected to racist belief that other neighborhoods are less valuable and therefore can have more toxins than your own neighborhood. And I think that there's a dynamic where we need collective action, and individual action can only take us so far. So my feeling about privilege is that people really have to, there's the individual part is divesting from the unearned gains. And then when you've done so, joining the struggle, like not trying to lead it, take it over, not trying to be a savior, but once you've been, and it's an ongoing process, but once you kind of divest from those unearned privileges, then you join, and like there's so many different places to join, so much good work out there, and then by starting to join that struggle, you make it stronger.
I feel like I've worked with a lot of people who see privilege as a bad thing and are saying, or will get guilty about it and feel bad about it. But I say with privilege, privilege is power. And if you recognize where your privileges are, and then you're able to say, I can be in this space, I can create space for other people, I can make space at this table for people that are not able to be here, or utilizing that for good, right? And I think that privilege manifests in many, many different ways, right? Like the fact that I am able to have a college degree, the fact that I'm able to pay my rent and not worry about it anymore, right? Like these are all things that that change. And so being able to recognize where I have privilege, where I don't, where can I use the places that I do have privilege in order to create space for the people that don't have it, right? Recognizing how can I lift up and support. I think with what's going on right now, I've had a lot of conversations with white coworkers around, they're like, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to start. I don't know how to, and so being able to kind of utilize the fact that I'm in this space, that I'm able to kind of push them to be like, all right, here's where you can donate, here's how you can get involved, here's how you can push your leaders. And I think that particularly I wanted to say that, you know, what gives me hope right now is that our young people and all of you doing all of this work and bringing up these conversations, it might sometimes feel like adults don't listen, or they don't, like, there's a lot of adultism in the world. And I feel like yet there's still something so powerful about having your voices being heard. And I just want to commend you all for making this space and for doing the work that you do, because that is so incredibly important.
So sort of related to what Jamie just said, for our final question, we sort of just wanted to end on kind of a positive note. So our last question is, with such a significant and complex issue as environmental justice, what is kind of something that's keeping you optimistic?
I definitely want to piggyback off of what Jamie was saying. And for me, it is definitely the passion and the persistence that our youth have. Being able to see such young people leading climate strikes around the globe is very uplifting. And just hearing how so many of you are willing to just go in and tackle government and try and, you know, go up to their front doors and say, hey, we need these changes now. Because I think, yeah, what is very optimistic for me is that knowing such young people willing to step out there, use their voices, and show that they care and are working hard to make that change when so many adults are not willing to. And I find so much value in being able to hear youth speak up about the things that they care about. And I know other adults do as well, and want to make space for youth to have their say at that table, because I know that, you know, traditionally those spaces aren't made for you. And even if the issue at hand impacts you directly, youth are not usually given an opportunity to be at that table to, you know, make those plans or have a say in the design or of the policy or whatever is being put in place. And that's one thing that I really appreciate in the work that I do as an educator, is to be able to work with youth and have programming that's very hyper local and focusing on community issues that, you know, our fourth graders experience day to day, and have that personal connection and be able to see how they can go home and make change in their communities. And as they get older, that is something that is deeply connected to them and that they'll carry forward with them into adulthood.
I echo a lot of what was already said, and the things that make me hopeful are the strong social movements. Many of them, as people said, youth-led movements, standing the fight against the the DAPL pipeline, the Standing Rock resistance, the resistance up in, you know, in British Columbia against pipeline infrastructure, resistance in our area around fossil fuel infrastructure, have all been very powerful. And you add on to that youth-led climate strike and sunrise movement, and then, you know, we're in the midst of profound rebellion against police brutality right now, and climate justice is not the demand, but as we know, these things are interrelated. And we know that people, because of the failures of our system, of our education system, and of our government in general, we know that people learn a lot very quickly when social movements happen, and they, you know, their socialization changes, and I think we're seeing that right now. There's still obviously a lot of you know, progress to be made, but I feel very hopeful when movements happen, and we have very strong movements right now for climate justice. Doesn't mean they couldn't be better. Obviously, also, I think a lot more people with privilege need to join those movements in a meaningful way. but those are the things that give me hope, and also, just allow us to tap into the previous work that's been done to make the world whole.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I want to thank you so much for saying your piece and for helping us learn about what we can do to support efforts to stop climate change and to dismantle the systemic environmental racism that we experience in our community. And I think that's really amazing that we had the opportunity to be able to talk with such amazing individuals as yourselves. So this is the last episode of our Earth Focus series. If you have not, we recommend you listen to our past episodes: pollution, climate change, ocean acidification. And so all of those will be linked down below in the description. So with that, are there any final statements you guys would like to say, or?
Just thank you. This work that you all are doing is amazing, and just so impressive, with all the media and the level of just what you bring to it is so amazing. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, KayLani. Thank you, Jamie, for coming as well and talking. We really appreciate hearing your voices. So I guess, does anyone have any closing statements?
I guess I would just say that, well, thank you for creating this space. Thank you for all of the work that you all are doing. I'm also honored to share this space with KayLani and David. It was a great conversation. And I also think about, we're in this work for the long haul and for the long game. And there have been times over the last several years where I've, especially in the last 3 to 4 years, felt really discouraged, and sometimes you can't tell if you're making a difference, and sometimes I've brought up institutional racism in my work, and sometimes it gets heard and sometimes it really doesn't. So but what has given me hope over time is that we're all in this for the long run, and that that we are seeing progress, and there is things changing, and that when you need a break, take a break, and make sure you're in this not just for now, not just for tomorrow, but for years to come, because the struggle for justice will always be there, right?
Absolutely.
And I too want to echo what everyone said, and thank you for making the space for this great group of people to come together and have this conversation.
Okay, well, we are really truly out of time, but thank you again for coming. So with that, I guess we'll maybe talk to you guys later. Okay, bye.
Thank you.